Syria, a land steeped in history, was once a vibrant tapestry of cultures and traditions. This ancient land, often referred to as the cradle of civilization, has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of religions, and the mingling of diverse peoples over millennia. Its bustling marketplaces, like the ancient souks of Aleppo, were a symphony of sights, sounds, and scents. These markets were not just places of commerce, but also social hubs where stories were exchanged, and traditions were passed down through generations. Imagine the aroma of freshly baked bread mingling with the sweet perfume of jasmine. These simple yet profound experiences were the essence of daily life, creating a sensory tapestry that was uniquely Syrian. Nestled in the heart of the Middle East, Syria boasts a rich heritage dating back to the dawn of civilization. Its strategic location made it a crossroads for trade and cultural exchange, influencing and being influenced by neighboring regions. From the Roman ruins of Palmyra to the majestic Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, the country was a testament to its storied past. These architectural marvels stood as silent witnesses to the grandeur and complexity of Syria's history. Its diverse population, a mosaic of ethnicities and religions, coexisted in relative harmony. Christians, Muslims, Jews, and other communities lived side by side, contributing to a rich cultural and social fabric. Syria's strategic location at the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe has made it a cultural melting pot for millennia. This unique position allowed it to absorb and blend influences from various civilizations, creating a vibrant and dynamic culture. The echoes of ancient empires and the whispers of forgotten gods lingered in its ancient cities and desert landscapes. These remnants of the past were not just historical artifacts, but living memories that shaped the identity of the Syrian people. The country was a treasure trove of archaeological wonders, a living testament to the ebb and flow of history. Each artifact unearthed told a story of a bygone era, adding to the rich tapestry of Syria's heritage. The Syrian people, known for their warmth and hospitality, took pride in their heritage and looked forward to a brighter future. Family gatherings, communal meals, and festive celebrations were integral parts of their social life, reflecting their deep-rooted traditions and values. Little did they know that their world was about to be turned upside down. The peace and stability they cherished were on the brink of being shattered by forces beyond their control. The winds of change, sweeping across the Arab world, were about to engulf Syria in a maelstrom of conflict and chaos. The Arab Spring, which began with hopes of reform and freedom, would soon lead to unprecedented turmoil and suffering for the Syrian people. In December 2010, a Tunisian street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself ablaze in a desperate act of protest against government corruption and oppression. Bouazizi's act was not just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of the widespread frustration and anger felt by many Tunisians. His self-immolation was a cry for dignity and justice in a society where both seemed out of reach. This act of self-immolation, captured on video and shared across the globe, sparked a wave of uprisings across the Arab world, known as the Arab Spring. The footage of Bouazizi's protest spread rapidly through social media and news outlets, resonating with millions who saw their own struggles reflected in his plight. Like wildfire, the flames of revolution spread from Tunisia to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and beyond. Each country had its own unique set of grievances, but they were united by a common desire for change. The people were no longer willing to accept the status quo. They demanded an end to corruption, oppression, and economic hardship. People, long silenced by authoritarian regimes, found their voices and took to the streets, demanding freedom, democracy, and social justice. The streets, once silent under the weight of fear, now echoed with chants for liberty and reform. The courage of ordinary citizens became the driving force behind this unprecedented movement. The Arab Spring was a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human heart, its yearning for a better world. It showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the desire for freedom and justice could not be extinguished. The movement inspired hope and solidarity across borders, proving that the human spirit is resilient and unyielding. The Syrian people, inspired by the courage of their Arab brethren, watched with bated breath as dictators fell and regimes crumbled. They saw a glimmer of hope for their own future, a possibility that they too could rise against tyranny. The images of successful uprisings in neighboring countries fueled their desire for change. They too had long endured the iron-fisted rule of the Assad dynasty, a regime notorious for its brutality and repression. The Assad regime had maintained its grip on power through fear, violence, and a pervasive security apparatus. The Syrian people had suffered under this oppressive rule for decades, and the time for change seemed ripe. The seeds of discontent sown decades earlier were about to bear bitter fruit. Years of economic mismanagement, political repression, and social injustice had created a volatile environment. The Syrian people were ready to challenge the status quo, and the Arab Spring provided the perfect catalyst for their uprising. In March 2011, a group of teenagers in the southern city of Daraa, inspired by the events unfolding across the Arab world, spray-painted anti-government slogans on a school wall. Their act of defiance, though seemingly small, was a bold statement against the regime. It was a declaration that the youth of Syria would no longer be silenced. Their act of defiance, seemingly insignificant, proved to be the spark that ignited the powder keg of Syrian discontent. The arrest and brutal treatment of these teenagers by the authorities triggered widespread outrage and protests. What began as a small act of rebellion quickly escalated into a nationwide movement for change. The arrest and torture of the teenagers in Daraa sparked outrage across Syria. These young boys, accused of anti-government graffiti, became the unlikely catalysts for a nationwide movement. Their brutal treatment at the hands of security forces ignited a firestorm of anger and resentment that had been simmering under the surface for years. Protests, initially small and localized, quickly spread to other parts of the country. What started as isolated incidents of dissent in Daraa soon blossomed into a full-fledged uprising, with demonstrations erupting in cities and towns across Syria. The spirit of resistance was contagious, and the call for change resonated far and wide. People from all walks of life, united by their shared grievances against the regime, took to the streets, demanding an end to corruption, oppression, and injustice. Students, workers, professionals, and even members of the military joined the ranks of the protesters, each driven by a deep-seated desire for freedom and dignity. The Syrian government, caught off guard by the scale and intensity of the protests, responded with brutal force. The regime's initial shock quickly turned into a calculated campaign of repression, aimed at crushing the burgeoning movement before it could gain further momentum. Security forces opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing and injuring hundreds. The streets of Syria became battlegrounds, with scenes of bloodshed and chaos unfolding daily. The government's ruthless tactics only served to deepen the resolve of the protesters, who refused to be silenced. The regime's heavy-handed tactics, far from quelling the uprising, only served to fuel the flames of dissent. Each act of violence by the authorities was met with renewed determination from the people, who were now fighting not just for reform, but for their very survival. As the violence escalated, so too did the demands of the protesters. What began as a call for basic reforms quickly evolved into a revolutionary movement, with the ultimate goal of toppling the Assad regime. The protesters' chants grew louder and more defiant, echoing through the streets and squares of Syria. What began as calls for reform quickly morphed into demands for the overthrow of the Assad regime. The people of Syria, emboldened by their collective strength, were no longer willing to accept half measures or empty promises. They wanted real change, and they were prepared to fight for it. The Syrian people, having tasted the heady air of freedom, were no longer willing to accept anything less than a complete overhaul of the political system. The sense of empowerment and unity among the protesters was palpable, as they stood together in defiance of a regime that had ruled with an iron fist for decades. Faced with mounting pressure, the Syrian government doubled down on its crackdown. The regime's response grew increasingly draconian, with security forces employing ever more brutal methods to suppress the uprising. The streets of Syria were filled with the sounds of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. Security forces, backed by tanks and helicopters, laid siege to restive cities, indiscriminately shelling civilian areas and carrying out mass arrests. The regime's message was clear: any challenge to its authority would be met with overwhelming force. The regime's message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the spirit of defiance among the Syrian people remained unbroken. Their struggle for freedom and justice continued, undeterred by the regime's relentless repression. The Syrian government, led by President Bashar Al-Assad, unleashed a reign of terror upon its own people, sparking international outrage. Security forces, notorious for their brutality, tortured and killed detainees with impunity, showing no mercy. Prisons became overcrowded hellholes where inmates were subjected to unspeakable horrors and unimaginable suffering. The regime's crackdown drove many Syrians to take up arms in self-defense, leading to widespread violence. Defectors from the Syrian army, along with civilian volunteers, formed the Free Syrian Army, a loosely organized rebel group determined to topple the Assad regime by force. The Syrian civil war had begun, marking the start of a prolonged and devastating conflict. The conflict quickly descended into a brutal and complex quagmire, with no end in sight. The Syrian army, backed by Russia and Iran, bombarded rebel-held areas, while the Free Syrian Army, supported by Western and Gulf countries, fought back with whatever weapons they could muster. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, bore the brunt of the violence, suffering immensely. As the war raged on, the country became increasingly fragmented, with territories constantly changing hands. Different rebel groups, each with their own agendas and allegiances, emerged, further complicating the conflict. The Syrian people, once united in their opposition to the Assad regime, were now divided by ideology, ethnicity, and religion, creating deep societal rifts. Extremism, in its many forms, has been on the rise in recent years. This phenomenon, often fueled by misinformation and divisive rhetoric, can have devastating effects on communities and nations alike. Understanding the roots and triggers of extremism is crucial in combating its spread. By fostering open dialogue, promoting education, and encouraging empathy, we can work towards a more inclusive and peaceful society. In the midst of conflict, the world becomes a global battlefield. Nations are drawn into the fray, alliances are tested, and the stakes are higher than ever. The ripple effects of these battles are felt far and wide, affecting millions of lives in ways unimaginable. The toll of war is not just measured in territory lost or won, but in human lives. Families are torn apart, communities shattered, and the humanitarian crisis deepens. The suffering is immense and the world watches, often feeling helpless. As the conflict rages on, the balance of power shifts, old regimes fall, new ones rise, and the geopolitical landscape is forever altered. The decisions made in these moments will shape the future for generations to come. Yet, even in the darkest times, there is always a glimmer of hope. Acts of bravery and kindness emerge, and the human spirit proves resilient. Efforts for peace begin to take root, offering a chance for healing and rebuilding.